Okay, two key terms for today are systole and diastole. This describes the relaxation or contraction of the heart muscle. Systole is when either the atria or ventricles are contracting. Diastole is when either the atria or ventricles are relaxing. We see this every single time we go to the doctor and they take our blood pressure. The pressure in our brachial artery is usually expressed in two numbers. 120/80 would be ideal. The 120 is the pressure in that valve when the heart is in systole, which is contraction, and the 80 would represent the pressure in that vessel when the heart is relaxing, diastole. Based on the pressure that either the atrium or ventricles are exerting, we can tell which valves are open. Again, we said that valves open based on pressure. So if atrial pressure is greater than ventricle pressure, we are going to see the AV valves open. So the first thing to remember is that anytime atrial pressure is greater than ventricular pressure, the AV valves will open. This allows blood to move from the atrium to the ventricles. So if we look at the chart here, we see that atrial pressure is above ventricular pressure from point 1 until point 2. That means that the AV valves are open and blood is able to move from the atrium to the ventricles. When atrial pressure becomes lower than ventricular pressure, this forces the AV valves closed. Atrial pressure will become lower than ventricular pressure as the ventricles begin to contract or enter systole. From the graph that we see here, you can see that the heart begins to contract at point 2, which is indicated by the QRS complex. The QRS complex on our EKG indicates ventricular contraction. The contraction of the ventricles causes that AV valve to close. This prevents further blood from entering into the ventricles and allows the atria to enter filling phase, where it is just building up blood in the atrium, ready for when its pressure again becomes greater than ventricular pressure, and that will allow blood to once again flow from the atrium into the ventricles. So again, at point 2, ventricular pressure becomes greater than atrial pressure because the ventricles enter systole or contraction. This closes the AV valves and allows for atrial filling and allows for ventricular pressure to build up. So after the AV valves are closed, we enter a phase called ventricular isometric contraction. This is just a fancy way of saying that all the valves are closed because ventricular pressure is greater than atrial pressure, but is not as great as aortic pressure. The goal of the ventricles is to generate enough pressure to have a greater pressure than the aortic pressure. This will open the semilunar valves. There's a period of time where no blood is moving because atrial pressure is less than ventricular pressure, which closes the AV valve, but ventricular pressure is not greater than aortic pressure. This is from point 2 to point 3 on the graph. During this time, contraction of the ventricles continues, generating more and more pressure and tension until ventricular pressure overcomes aortic pressure. When ventricular pressure becomes greater than aortic pressure, the aortic valve opens. Again, during this time, the AV valves are closed because ventricular pressure is still greater than atrial pressure. When ventricular pressure becomes greater than aortic pressure, the aortic valve opens and blood is able to be pumped from the ventricle into the aorta to enter the systemic system. During this time, aortic pressure also will increase because more blood is entering that area than is draining off into the remainder of the system. This means that the aorta must have some elasticity to it, so it is able to accept a huge bulge of blood and then recoil as that blood drains off into the rest of the system. The aorta functions similar to a balloon. As we blow into the balloon, we get a huge bulging of the balloon, and as we let that air flow out, it returns to its original shape or its original state. The same happens with the aorta. It is able to elastically expand, and then the expansion, the elasticity of the aorta, puts pressure on that blood to force it further into the systemic system. The stroke volume is the amount of blood that is pumped from the ventricle into the aorta with every contraction. When ventricular pressure becomes less than aortic pressure, the aortic valve closes again. So in the diagram below, you see that we have the left ventricle and the aorta. The dotted line represents how much blood is in the ventricle at the start of contraction. At the end of contraction, the amount of blood ejected from the left ventricle is known as the stroke volume. The remaining blood in the ventricle at the end of contraction is known as end-diastolic volume. The more blood that you are able to pump out with every contraction tells us how efficient your heart is. Our body has a set need for an amount of blood to meet metabolic demands. If your body is able to eject more blood with every contraction, it needs to contract less often. This is why doctors are interested in your resting heart rate. If your resting heart rate is incredibly high, that gives us an indication that either your heart is not ejecting as much blood out with every stroke, there is a rapid decrease in ventricular pressure. This is when the ventricle is repolarizing and going through diastole. During this time, aortic pressure is greater than ventricular pressure, so the aortic valve is closed, but ventricular pressure is still greater than atrial pressure, so the AV valves are also closed. During this time, the atria continues to fill with blood from the vena cava. At point 5, ventricular pressure again falls below atrial pressure because the pressure in the atria, or the pressure on the AV valve, continues to increase as the atria fills with more and more blood. Once atrial pressure becomes greater than ventricular pressure, the AV valve opens again and ventricular filling occurs. So just like in skeletal muscles, the contraction of tissue generates a force. This force can be used to increase pressure. As we can see, at point A, atrial pressure begins to increase. This causes the contraction of the atria, pushing the final blood from the atria into the ventricles. As you can see at point B, we see relaxation of the ventricle muscle, which allows for a rapid decrease in ventricular pressure because the muscle tissue is entering a relaxation and repolarization. Anytime ventricular pressure is lower than atrial pressure, the AV valve is open and therefore the ventricles are filling with blood. Anytime ventricular pressure is greater than atrial pressure, the ventricles are either in an isovolumetric contraction, trying to generate more force than the aorta, or ejecting blood, or reestablishing their polarization. Metabolic demand is the amount of energy that our body needs at any given moment. Cardiac output is the amount of blood pumped from one ventricle into a system during 1 minute. Stroke volume is the amount of blood that's pumped out of the ventricle every time it contracts. Heart rate is the number of times the heart beats in a given minute. In order to meet metabolic demands, we can vary cardiac output by changing the amount of times our heart beats per minute or changing how much blood is pumped out with every beat. An example of this is me every morning since we've been put on leave, watching the news, drinking my coffee. As you can see, at rest, my metabolic demand decreases, which allows my cardiac output to also decrease, and this is accomplished by a small decrease in stroke volume and a significant decrease in my heart rate, beats per minute. In situation 2, you can see that I am out exercising, which results in an increase in metabolic demand, which results in an increase in cardiac output, accomplished by an increase in stroke volume and an increase in heart rate. You can have a real life example of this by simply walking up your stairs or thinking about walking to the 4th floor of the quad. No matter how good a shape you think you're in, by the time you get to the 4th floor of the quad, you're out of breath, your lungs feel like they're on fire, and your heart rate is significantly higher than it was at the bottom of the stairs. Now, if I got incredibly motivated and decided to run sprints up a hill, my metabolic demand will significantly increase. In order to meet the metabolic demand of my muscle tissue, my cardiac output must increase significantly. Once my heart rate has reached its max, the only other way to increase cardiac output is to increase stroke volume. At some point, our heart can no longer meet metabolic demand, and our cardiac output can no longer increase. When this happens, we have to slow down or cease activity. This is why we can't maintain our top end sprint speed very long. Our cardiac output can range anywhere from about 5 liters to about 25 liters per minute. It does this by significantly adjusting our heart rate and slightly adjusting our stroke volume. Our heart rate can range typically anywhere between 70 beats per minute all the way to 200 beats per minute. Our stroke volume can be altered based on our blood volume. If we're dehydrated, our stroke volume can increase less than if we are fully hydrated, and based on the strength of our ventricle muscles. The stronger our heart is, the more blood it can eject with every stroke. This is why endurance athletes tend to have more ventricular muscle than sedentary people, and why they're able to increase their cardiac output significantly more than sedentary people. Your left ventricle is significantly stronger and has more contractile tissue than a sedentary person, which allows more blood to be ejected with every beat. The question is, how does our body know to A, increase our heart rate, and B, increase its stroke volume? Remember back when we talked about the nervous system for Unit 1? We talked about the dual innervation of organs by both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic systems. The heart, like every other organ, has innervation by both systems. In our previous lecture, we talked about how the SA node is the pace setter node of the heart. The SA node dictates our heart rate by automatically drifting from resting membrane potential to threshold. Both the sympathetic and parasympathetic system innervate on the SA node. Both the sympathetic system and the parasympathetic system synapse on the SA node and the AV node. The sympathetic system can cause an increase in depolarization of the SA node, thereby increasing the heart rate, The parasympathetic system through the vagus nerve also innervates on the SA and AV node. Allows the parasympathetic system to decrease the number of action potentials generated by the SA node by increasing the time it takes to reach threshold of the autorhythmic cells. In addition, the sympathetic system also innervates the ventricles. The parasympathetic system does not innervate the ventricles significantly. The ability of the sympathetic system to innervate the ventricles allows for more forceful contraction, which allows for a greater amount of blood to be pushed out from the ventricles into the aorta with every beat. This is an increase in stroke volume. Therefore, the sympathetic system is able to influence both the heart rate and the stroke volume, which allows us to increase our cardiac output to that 25 liters per minute range by increasing our heart rate to 200 beats per minute and increasing our stroke volume to 125 milliliters per stroke. If you remember from our previous lecture, we said autorhythmic cells are different from normal nervous tissue and skeletal muscle because they do not need stimulation to have an action potential. If you remember, we said once the cell reached resting potential of -60, the funny channels open, allowing sodium to come in. Once threshold is reached, the funny channels close and calcium channels open to generate the action potential. Once peak membrane potential is reached, the calcium channels close and potassium channels open, allowing potassium to flood out of the cell. This drops the resting membrane potential back to -60. The -60 triggers the voltage-gated funny channels to open and repeats the cycle of sodium rushing into the cell, calcium channels opening, allowing calcium to rush in, generating the action potential, which is membrane potential is reached, the potassium channels open and reestablish resting membrane potential. When the parasympathetic system is innervating the SA node, it affects the amount of time it takes for threshold to be reached. As you can see, the parasympathetic system is represented by the green line. In the same amount of time that the SA node was depolarized twice, the parasympathetic system decreased it to 1 action potential. Remember, every action potential corresponds with the contraction of cardiac tissue. So in the example on the board, there is less parasympathetic innervation. There were 2 atrial contractions. When parasympathetic stimulation increased, in that same amount of time, there was 2 atrial contractions. Now there is only 1. Now is the example of an increase in sympathetic stimulation. With increased sympathetic stimulation, the time it takes to reach threshold is decreased, meaning that in the exact same amount of time it took to generate 2 action potentials, which are 2 atrial contractions, we were able to generate 3 atrial contractions through 3 depolarizations. As you can see, nothing changes in ion movement. Every single time the funny channels open to allow sodium into the cell until threshold is reached, calcium channels open at threshold to allow the action potential to be generated. Once peak potential is reached, potassium channels open to allow potassium to stream out of the cell, reestablishing resting potential. What does change is the amount of time it takes for threshold to be reached. With increased sympathetic stimulation, it takes less time and therefore more action potentials are generated. With parasympathetic stimulation, it takes more time for threshold to be reached, which results in less action potentials being generated. All right, so now that we've looked at heart rate, we can look at stroke volume. Stroke volume is controlled both intrinsically by venous return and the length tension curve of muscle. It's also controlled extrinsically by the rate of sympathetic stimulation to the ventricles. When we think about venous return, there are two analogies to consider. The first consideration would be that of a slingshot. If I have a slingshot in example A, my slingshot, I've only pulled back on the rock slightly, probably about 50% of its full capacity. In comparison, in example B, I've pulled back almost as far as that slingshot can be pulled. Which one would result in greater force and a longer distance of that rock being shot? Everyone would say that example B is going to generate more force and launch the rock further than in example A. Example B is going to shoot that rock further because we exerted a greater stretch and therefore have more potential energy to launch the rock further. The second example, so now that we agree that more stretch on a slingshot would generate more force and therefore eject more blood, how do we get that stretch in the heart? This brings us to example B. It is a hose that is filling up 2 water balloons. In example A, the water balloon is not as filled as example B. Which water balloon has a greater stretch exhibited on it? Again, I think we can all agree that example B has a greater stretch because it's filled with more water. Now, if we imagine that instead of that being a hose connected to a balloon, it was our venous system connected to our ventricle, we can see that the more blood that the venous system returns to our heart, the greater the stretch that is going to be placed on the ventricle. By combining these two examples, we can see that the greater we stretch the ventricle, the more force it is going to generate, which allows greater distance or more blood to be moved out of the ventricle when it contracts. The net result of this is a greater stroke volume and a smaller end systolic volume in the ventricles. This means that more blood was pumped out of the ventricle with each contraction. The second thing that contributes to the intrinsic control of stroke volume is the length tension curve. If you remember back to our last unit, we can remember the skeletal muscle length tension curve. We said that at resting length, the skeletal muscle was able to generate maximum contraction force. As we decreased the length of the muscle or increased the length of the muscle, we saw a corresponding decrease in muscle force. If this was the way that cardiac muscle was arranged, this would be a problem, because as we stretched the muscle, as we increased venous return, we would move closer to that L plus N, and if it reacted the same way as skeletal muscle, we would see that we would actually lose tension and contraction force. The great thing about cardiac muscle is that at resting length, it does not generate maximal tension. As we stretch the cardiac muscle further and further in length, it actually is able to generate more and more force. It doesn't reach maximum tension until it has been significantly stretched. Again, just like skeletal muscle, it does have its breaking point. So if we stretched it too much, we would see a decrease in tension. However, this would not occur in real life. The combination of the skeletal muscle's length tension curve generating maximum force as it is stretched and the ability to change venous return to increase the stretch of the ventricles allows for intrinsic control of stroke volume and allows us to increase stroke volume as metabolic demand becomes greater. The intrinsic control of stroke volume can be summarized by Frank-Starling law. Frank-Starling law states that the larger the end diastolic volume, the greater the stroke volume is going to be. This is summarized again in another way by saying the greater the stretch, i.e. venous return, the greater the output, i.e. the more blood we can get out with every contraction. We can also see how this circles us back to the beginning conversation of metabolic demand and cardiac output. At rest, we see that the end diastolic volume is around 70 milliliters. If we dot that up, as we did by the first orange dot, we see that the resting stroke volume is significantly lower than it could be. If we move to the E, which is the example of exercise, we see that end diastolic volume is larger than at rest, which corresponds to a greater stroke volume or a greater output. Now, if we look at the extrinsic control of stroke volume, we see that sympathetic stimulation increases the contractility of the heart. This means that for a given end diastolic volume, there is going to be a greater stroke volume because we've increased the contractility of the heart. This increase in contractility increases the amount of tension and cross bridges a cardiac muscle is able to generate. This leads to a greater force that allows for a greater output. As you can see, if we took the exact same resting end diastolic volume and the exact same exercise end diastolic volume and increased epinephrine or norepinephrine into the circulatory system, we would see a greater stroke volume for the same end diastolic volume. Finally, the last thing that can affect Frank-Starling's law is heart failure. With heart failure, we see a decrease in contractile ability by cardiac cells. For a heart failure patient, we see that for the same end diastolic volume, they're able to generate significantly less, they are able to generate a significantly lower stroke volume and therefore a significantly less blood output. They are less able to meet the metabolic demands of the tissue and therefore are able to sustain only low intensity exercises.